Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you everybody for being with us in the latest episode in our Keys webinar series, our monthly broadcast to our clients around the world. We're delighted to have you with us today. We're looking forward to a great session where we are going to get into the details of one of the big topics facing businesses and organizations today. I'm going to start, as we do every month, with a look at the latest public opinion research to try to diagnose the dynamics of the latest mood, which leads us naturally into today's topic, ESG, Environment, Social, Governance. It's a very broad, very deep, very dynamic topic, and it can feel, as Lauren is about to tell us, like everything, everywhere, all at once. She's going to help us make sense of it all and map out the territory. We're then going to be joined by Radhika, who's in Singapore. And Radhika is going to help us think about what we need to be doing to look at these topics in the context of different cultures and different countries, sharing some new analysis that she and the team have been doing. And then we're going to be back in New York with Manuel. Lauren's in New York also, and he's going to share with us some new analysis we've been doing to help us better understand inequality in the world today and how to do a better job at researching inequalities as we go about our own work and address our own business priorities. So as we go through, a reminder that we're really looking forward to having your questions through the wonders of technology. We will be able to share and feedback on your questions with the panel as we go through. So please do use the chat box as we go through, and there's time for questions at the end. In terms of where we are now, the dynamics of public opinion, well, it can feel this year like it's always bad news. Looking back at the last month, I can at least find some reasons potentially to be cheerful. Global consumer confidence is rising to the highest point in 16 months. That's the headline from our latest consumer confidence index. We're finding some improvements in Europe, which has tended to be the capital of gloom this year. And we found 10 countries actually which are really now showing a better measure than they had in the previous months. So perhaps some tentative signs that at least things might be looking a little bit less bad. And the reason I say a little bit less bad is because I find many reasons to be cautious in some of the other data that we have. Our new Ipsos Global Inflation Monitor, 29 countries, designed to get into the details of how people feel and how they're responding to the challenges of our cost of living crisis. That has some pretty stark results. The headline is that half the public across 29 countries think their country is in recession. Now, economists may challenge this and say, well, actually, these countries aren't in recession, but it's about how people feel. And with their cost of living and their spending power under pressure, we can perhaps see why we're getting results like this. We can find more than half of people in these countries representing Asia, Europe, and Latin America, saying that as far as they're aware, their economy is in recession, and very significant numbers in other countries around the world. So some markers there in terms of how people feel about their country. But there's also some markers when we ask people specifically about how they're managing these days in their lives. How are you doing? Well, my chart stops after 24 countries. So from Argentina through to Canada, we have more than half of the people are telling us they're just about managing, the yellow in the chart, or indeed finding it fairly or very difficult. So people's self-assessment is that they're having to be careful, cautious, or indeed that they're having a pretty bad time. How long until things get back to normal? We used to talk about the new normal. I don't think we do that anymore. But how long do you think it will take before inflation returns to normal in your country? Well, look at the right-hand side of the chart. You'll see that in most countries, the expectation is that it will be more than 12 months, if ever, that until we see prices back to some kind of typical level that we're used to in the country where we live. And this has been noted in our latest update document by our Chief Executive, Ben Page, who observes about how important it is to stay close to consumers these days. He notes that consumers have often been more accurate than central bankers in terms of their expectations of what's going to happen next. And it's going to be the topic we're going into in more detail in next month's webinar, where we're really going to try and understand the dynamics of consumers, the poly crisis, and how things feel right now. But our focus today is on ESG, the ESG imperative, the imperative to take action, and there's action certainly taking place or being proposed at business headquarters around the world. These are the views of corporate reputation professionals, and we bring it together in a document we call the Ipsos Reputation Council. They're pretty clear that ESG has fundamentally changed the way our business operates. 55% agree, and they have an absolute consensus now that poor ESG performance has material consequences for their organization. We've got a new study which takes that forward, going to be launched later this month, called the ESG Council, and this is where we're specifically researching the views of chief sustainability officers in businesses around the world and getting their take on the issues that they see. And with that in mind, I'm really delighted that we've got our own Chief Sustainability Officer, Lauren Demar, who's with us today in New York, where it's firstly very early, and secondly, it's going through an environmental event as I speak. Lauren, thank you so much for being with us. We're looking forward to your tour of Everything, Everywhere, All at Once.
Thank you, Simon. Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. Have you seen this movie? It won the Academy Award this year and is in fact now the most awarded film of all time. Now, if you ask someone who's actually seen the movie to tell you what the movie is about, they will probably struggle to explain it to you, just like ESG, which is a complex and confusing topic that can be tough to explain. But let's give it a try. Like the title of the movie, ESG is about everything, everywhere, all at once. It's about everything. It's about how a business affects the environment, including carbon emissions, pollution and recycling, waste management, and energy use. It's about how a business treats its employees, its customers, its communities, including diversity and inclusion, HR policies, safety, and charitable work. It's about how a business is run, ensuring that it's run ethically and in a way that manages risk. And ESG is everywhere. It's global. It's important to all businesses around the world, no matter the sector. It's important to governments and NGOs too. And it's about doing all of that all at once so that a business creates value for all of its stakeholders, its employees, its customers, and its investors. ESG challenges are some of the largest that the world faces today. Just take a look at some of the headlines from the past year. Heat waves, wildfires, floods, gender and racial inequality, disabilities in the workplace. All of this relates to ESG. These are big fundamental issues, global issues, and these challenges are not going away anytime soon. While other issues like inflation may rise to the top of the list of concerns in the short term, ESG is here for the long term. These are not challenges that will be solved overnight. And citizens are concerned. Our Ipsos Global Trends report tells us that 80% agree that we're headed for environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly. And in our What Worries the World survey, poverty and social inequality is the #2 global concern, where it's been for quite some time. So what do people want businesses to do? When we asked people what part of ESG is most important for businesses to focus on, improving society was ranked as the top priority among citizens globally at 42%. This makes sense, given that earlier we shared that poverty and social inequality is the #2 global concern. But this doesn't mean that citizens don't want businesses to focus on the environment. it was still ranked as the #1 priority by 29% of people. And in our recent Earth Day survey, we asked people if they agree with the statement, if businesses in country X do not act now to combat climate change, they will be failing their employees and their customers. As you can see here, citizens around the world overwhelmingly agree with this. When it comes to the environment, citizens want it all. Globally, reducing waste and pollution is an even hotter topic than climate change, no pun intended. Reducing the use of plastic and developing more environmental products and reducing greenhouse gas emissions are other actions that companies can take. These priorities have been very stable year over year and are generally consistent in regions across the world. Everything, everywhere, all at once. When trying to navigate all of this, what should companies do? What should they focus on? We have 4 principles to keep in mind when it comes to developing an ESG strategy for your business. The first is to avoid the pitfall of ESG silos. The second is to mind the gap. But which gap is it? Is it the say-do gap or the believe-true gap? The third principle is to make sustainability a co-benefit and not the only benefit. And the fourth is to communicate what you are doing in ESG, to do it carefully, to say it, but to say it right. So I just want to say a few words about each of these. Avoiding the pitfall of ESG silos is important. Remember, when we asked people about the ESG priorities for multinational companies, 42% put social first, but almost a third chose environmental and governance. So we need to be careful not to treat the E, the S, and the G in silos and focus on only one. You don't want to be the company that is making great progress in decarbonizing your supply chain and shouting about it, and then get called out by your employees for having a toxic work environment, as an example. It's dangerous to pursue just one area of ESG without consideration of the others. Our second principle is about say do or believe true. I hear a lot of talk about say do. People intend to do the right thing, but they don't always follow through with their actions. And that's true, that happens. But what we aren't talking enough about are the misperceptions and the knowledge gap that exists when it comes to fighting climate change in particular. In fact, people believe that their actions have a far greater impact than they actually do. When we ask people, which 3 of the following actions do you think would have the most impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions? 1/3 put recycling at number 2, and almost a quarter of the people put using less packaging at number 3. But what is the reality? This slide shows the true rank of each of these activities over on the far right. Recycling is actually in 60th place, and using less packaging comes in at number 38. And only 18% of people felt that living car-free would have an impact, when it's actually the number 1 culprit. Now, I will say that this is an improvement from last year, when half the people surveyed put recycling as the number 1 action they could take to reduce their carbon footprint. And now we see that switching to renewable electricity is at number 1, but the believe true gap exists. And there are a lot of misperceptions and confusion when it comes to ESG. Businesses can lead the way here. For example, by educating consumers through clear labeling on their products. A question that we get a lot is whether consumers are willing to pay for ESG or sustainable products. People say that they're willing to pay more. In fact, as you can see here, 64% globally agree that they try to buy products from businesses that act responsibly, even if it means they have to spend a bit more. Generally, people want to feel like they would do the right thing. But when put to the test, this doesn't always happen in the moment. We designed a shelf test in the US using our simulated store platform called SimStore, and we asked people to shop for dishwash liquid soaps. Along with the usual brands, we showed people a made-up brand that we tested with and without a sustainability claim on the pack. At a price premium, People were not more likely to choose the sustainable option. However, at the same price of $4.25, which you can see in the first two columns, people were more likely to choose the sustainable option. Consumers are worried about the environment and they want businesses to act, but they are really looking for this to be delivered as a co-benefit and not the only benefit. As a co-benefit, sustainable claims can tip the scale. With all of the concerns about getting accused of greenwashing, isn't it better to just say nothing? Greenwashing is when companies intentionally mislead the public by presenting an environmentally responsible public image. Some businesses are worried about getting accused of greenwashing, so they're hesitant about whether they should advertise their sustainability actions. So what's our advice here? With our fourth principle is this: you want to say it, but say it right. First of all, sustainability ads can get lost in a sea of sameness, making them struggle to stand out. Many of them are using similar messaging, they use similar imagery, they depict nature or wind turbines, or they use the color green. And as a result, they're not grabbing the attention of the viewer. So if you're going to communicate about sustainability, you really need to do so in a creative way. Secondly, sustainability ads need to say something about the brand too. Ads that combine a sustainability and a brand message are 28% more effective. Levi's is a great example of getting this right. Their ad focuses on durability, which is both a brand benefit as well as a sustainability claim, since the jeans last longer. And finally, there's a clear difference in ads that ask people to do something, such as you should start recycling or you should join the fight, and ads where the brand itself is taking action. Sustainability ads are 19% more effective if the focus is on what the brand does and what actions the brand is taking versus just asking people to do something. Now let's take a look at an example of a brand that gets sustainability advertising right by focusing on what actions the brand is taking. Volvo defines safety in the automotive sector. They have leveraged that positioning to make the link between safety of the environment and the safety of people on this planet, with the ultimate safety test being protecting the environment for generations to come, and the role that Volvo is playing in doing that. This ad tested very well. Take a look.
This is the big one, 100-foot drop. So is this the ultimate safety test? Well, it depends.
It really is a fantastic ad. Everything, everywhere, all at once. ESG is an overwhelming topic with high expectations from citizens around the world and many opportunities to get it right and also to get it wrong. But taking action on ESG initiatives is increasingly becoming a necessity. To win in the years to come, smart businesses will act now to ensure that they remain relevant and profitable. Simon, back to you.
Oh, thank you, Lauren, so much for this tour de force. And we're already getting lots of requests for copies of your slides, which suggest that what you've said has really struck a chord with our participants around the world. So just to reiterate, we'll be forwarding to you the slides tomorrow with recording and indeed the deck for you to download. So don't worry, the resources will all be available to everybody on the call today. Lauren, thanks so much for that panorama. I'm conscious you've been in role now for 6 months or so, and perhaps a good moment perhaps to share your perspectives on the role that you're doing. And I think in particular, perhaps you could share with us what surprised you most about taking on the role and exploring and discussing our clients' agendas.
Well, first of all, Simon, I have to say that it's been very sobering just to play in this space and to see, all of the things that are going on, particularly as it comes to the environment, but not only. I mean, inequality, diversity, inclusion. I mean, these are tough, weighty topics. I think what I have found very surprising is that some companies have really not started on the ESG journey in a concerted way. I think because really it's such a big and overwhelming topic, because it can be difficult to address within a company just due to the number of internal stakeholders across functional areas who need to be involved, who need to weigh in, who need to help with decision making, and because it's challenging to know where to start. We also find that some companies are, jumping right in, and they're taking specific actions, like they're creating sustainable products or services, or they're developing advertising campaigns without doing the necessary upfront work to understand their customers, to define their ESG strategies. And you really need to do that upfront work. So Ipsos, we have a very straightforward way of looking at the ESG journey, and we can be very, very helpful here.
Well, that point you mentioned about jumping right in, I think, is a good lead in actually to what we're going to hear from Radhika, because one of the issues, of course, is to be alive to particular countries and contexts. So yes, it's a global agenda, but Radhika, the work that you've been doing, I think, has been all about how to try to uncouple that and how to make sure that we're really thinking about different cultures and different perspectives if we're going to really do a good job at understanding and then taking the kinds of steps that Lauren was mentioning. So Radhika, thank you so much for joining us and sharing with us the work that you've been doing in recent months. Over to you.
Thanks, Simon, and hi, everybody. Really fascinating to hear Lauren talk about everything everywhere all at once. I'm going to talk to you now about culture and how it shapes perceptions and priorities around ESG. What I will be sharing is actually a huge body of work that has been curated and some meta-analysis done, specifically looking at cultural inputs for ESG. So we are talking about Global Trends Survey, which goes back many years, and you can actually see the shifts in attitudes. We have targeted global advisors studies, specifically on different topics around ESG. On top of this, we integrated a lot of secondary research to look at cultural values, historical practices around ESG and new trends. And last but not least, we worked with our local market champions, both cultural experts and ESG champions, for bottom-up insights. So you're seeing a synthesis of all of that in what I'm going to share now. And all to say that this is really an example of putting the Ipsos framework for cultural transferability to work. So we take global concepts and see how that can be cascaded seamlessly across different cultures. So, and this helps us because we are fluent in many cultures. A lot of assets which helps us understand bottom up what is the local culture and how it is shaping different topics and different global concepts. And all of this then helps you navigate this global local landscape with nuance, empathy, and creativity. So let me go on to the analysis and what we found. Now, looking at all the data and comparing their scores on various topics and attitudes, we could identify 3 clear dimensions, and all of these 3 are cultural in nature and how they shape sentiments on ESG. The first one is, what is the relationship with nature within a culture? It could be one of conquest, which is essentially mastery over nature for progress and growth, and it is a very interventionist approach. Or it could be coexistence, where there's a belief of interconnectedness and a lot of rituals and celebration around nature, also a lot of negotiation. So it is much more an approach of appeasement with nature. The second one was responsibility. Whose responsibility is it to drive impact on ESG issues? Is it the individual who can take on the onus and who can then drive impact? So you're literally living your values, you're living your commitment. Or is it institutions where you're looking for guidance from authority? It could be governments, but more and more we are finding it is really the business and corporate sector, with a lot of implications for partnerships that brands start building. And the third one is around reward. Who benefits most through ESG initiatives? Is it the larger, wider world and all humanity, and where you may or may not see the rewards in your lifetime, and it's something which is building up for future, so you're leaving the earth in a better shape for future generations? Or is it something where when I take certain initiatives for ESG, I see an immediate benefit that impacts my world in real time? So it makes my life better, or I can see the impact on people around me, my family. So these are the three broad dimensions. And now let's look at how we can use these dimensions to understand the influence of culture within each of these countries. So I've taken two countries as examples. There are many more which you'll see coming in the more detailed reports. So the first one is USA. Now in USA, when we look specifically at the culture around ESG, it is one of activism. US comes from a history of conquest, the conquering the frontiers, taming the wilderness, and consumerism plays a very, very big role. Consumerism and the need to flaunt success and achievement, which is very much part of the cultural fabric, is seen to have contributed to a lot of the ills of ESG, and therefore brand choice becomes very, very critical. You're judged on the choices you make. So you can see there is a strong skew to the E part of ESG, and increasingly now to the S, with inclusivity, diversity, DEI, all of those discourses coming in. Relatively less for G. And if you see the three dimensions and how US is profiled on it, you can see it's quite on the left. So it is a relationship which is of conquest or mastery over nature. So the attitude now is, we know we created the problem, but we also know how to fix it. It is one of trying to control the nature and control the issues and the problem. If you think about responsibility and agency, the individual takes on a lot of responsibility. It is an individualistic culture, and therefore they believe every individual can make an impact, can drive change, and therefore there is even a willingness for sacrifice towards this responsibility. And when it comes to rewards too, you see the commitment to a longer term benefit, where you are thinking about how this is going to benefit the future generations. Often also intangible benefits. So that was US. Now let's look at a very contrasting and different culture, which is India. Now in India, the culture around ESG is very much about moderation. It's a culture that has always frowned upon excesses and overindulgence. So the same approach comes to ESG. It is about, if you do everything in moderation, nothing will go askew. So it's moderation, balance, resources are to be stretched to benefit more people. So co-living, repurpose, reuse. You can see the human aspects play a very important role. Also a lot of nurturing and caring aspects in relationship with nature. So you're looking at traditional medicine, and of course the great Indian inventiveness, which is Jugaad, which is all about finding smart hacks and solutions to problems around constraints and resources. So here you can see the balance is almost totally on S part of it, less so on E, but increasing expectations growing for G. And when we look at how India is profiled on the same three dimensions, it's almost like a mirror opposite of US. The relationship with nature is more of coexistence and negotiation. It's a little bit of give and take, and it's like nature will understand. In terms of responsibility, very clearly it is vested in the institutions. They look up to the government for guidance, and more so they expect the business sector to play a very important role in this, in starting to display leadership. And rewards, very much about here and now, which is true for a lot of emerging market cultures. So it is their time for progress. And therefore, if you have to make a choice between the world and my world for benefits, they are always going to prioritize on the brand benefits. So that was a very quick sort of walkthrough about cultural analysis and how we can apply it to these two countries. There, the issues may be same, but the way you land it, the way you cascade, and the way you activate will be very different if you want to co-opt people into your initiatives. So with that, like I mentioned, there's more coming, but with that, I'll hand it back over to Simon. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Radhika. Fascinating, and I'm not going to let you go just for the moment, because I think one of the things I took from that was, pause, reflect, think about the individual country and context, and I think some real good guiding principles there. I'm conscious you've got some more analysis that's coming out soon, and that you've been doing this work across a number of markets. So I just wondered if you could share with us any insights from maybe another country that you found interesting as you were doing this audit and this review.
Yeah, actually, every country is interesting because it's when you start seeing the nuances. And for instance, Brazil, I find very interesting because there is such an abundance of nature, and to some extent, they have historically, I think, assumed that this is always going to be there, this abundance. And then we heard in the podcast about that whole episode where there was like darkness in the middle of the day, and it was literally like the nature had decided to stop being this benevolent, benefactor. And I think that is what hit home, and it's been cascaded to a lot of the people today. I think ESG is a very important agenda of the government, and with people's support, and it's the government that came into. And I think it is these kind of things which give you an insight about culture's relationship with nature, the cues that they take to realize they are breaching some boundaries, and it's time for action. So there are a lot of interesting nuggets like that, and you'll see more of that when we do the analysis.
No, we're looking forward to that. And you mentioned darkness in the middle of the day, which for participants on the call who haven't listened to our podcast on the topic, this was Sao Paulo, and this was the experience very visibly felt by people in Brazil's largest city. I'm conscious as I go to Manuel, it's darkness in the middle of the morning, on the early morning at the moment, because it is early, but you're all over the news today as well with an environmental event. And I think we'll talk about that before we close the webinar. But Manuel, we wanted to hear your perspectives, a scientist based in the US, working around the world, thinking about these topics. So really I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on inequality and how we can get closer to this topic and do a better job at researching and following up. So Manuel, over to you.
Thank you, Simon. So yeah, as you said, on top of being a science, I sit in the steer co of D&I initiatives globally, internally at Ipsos, and I lead a number of global local initiatives in D&I. And we're going to talk today about inequality, which is an issue that really concerns a big part of the world. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau said that inequality is the root of all social ills. And while we might agree or disagree with his other postulates, we do know that inequality has a negative impact for everyone in society, not just for those that are recipient of unfair treatment. And when we talk about inequality, we talk about actual measured gaps in pay, in access to resources, in opportunity, and in treatment for some people versus others. Something that's very interesting that we see as the 21st century moves forward, we're almost like a quarter into this century, there's compelling evidence that it will be characterized by more inequality within countries rather than between the countries as it was in the 20th century. And we're talking about things from like racial inequality to issues of gender, sexual orientation, social class, age, religion, neurodiversity, and disability. But despite general agreement that inequality is a bad thing, and it's a bad thing for all, it's actually widening in many parts of the world, including major markets. So we need proactive efforts to push forward an equality agenda, because, as I said, inequality is actually widening in many parts of the world. And this is something that concerns the world. In April this year, we saw that over 30% of people around the world identified inequality as one of their primary concerns. At this point, only second to inflation, but it's been pretty steady throughout the past few months, and with other issues moving up and down. But this one is always one of the top issues that concern the world. And while inequality, like all the things in diversity and inclusion in general, they have different phases in different countries and different priorities, we see globally their primary concerns around inequality for some specific groups, starting with those people with physical disabilities at the top, followed by women, people with mental health conditions, the LGBTQ+ community, senior citizens, and also people from ethnic and racial minorities. But how did this happen? How did we even get here? When we look at it, we see that bias and inequality usually stems from a lie. It's a lie that eventually plays out in both conscious and implicit ways. And these are things like poor people don't work as hard as rich people, women's work is not worth as much as men's work, or things as absurd as like some people are superior because of different skin tone, things that actually make no sense and are deeply embedded in our history and in many structures. So while some of the things have historical reasons that explain how inequality came to be, there's also an individual factor that's key to its persistence. And I think we need to understand how this bias also become hardwired in our brain, in our mind, at an individual level, so we can start unpacking this problem. So we know that implicit bias is a form of bias that occur unintentionally and without conscious awareness. Those are based on memory associations that we have formed over the years. And we've even seen, which is interesting, how culture even impacts neural responses of how we perceive outgroups, which are those groups that we don't feel like we belong to. And these automatic cognitive processes, they impact our decisions, our attitudes, our behavior, and ultimately help perpetuate equality gaps. So things like increasing authentic representation of underrepresented group, and definitely define stereotypes that help break these connections in the brains and decrease that implicit bias. Because while these implicit associations have been learned, the good news is that they can also be unlearned. So let's work on that. So the data here is showing the proportion of people in the general population in different countries that consider that people of minority ethnic and racial groups are most experiencing unequal and unfair treatment. So we see Indonesia and Netherlands on the top, and then we see here in the United States of America, where actually in our demographics, people of a minority racial ethnic group represent about 40% of the population. So let's take a look a little closer to the situation here at home in the United States. We see that the racial wealth gap has actually widened again in the United States since the 80s, as capital gains have mainly benefited white households. And as we've said before, closing that equality gap would benefit all of us. We found studies that show that closing this US racial wealth gap could lead to an increase of 4 to 6% of the US GDP by 2028. So definitely not a minor thing. But what can we do and what can you do? We've seen that a majority of consumers here in the US think that it's appropriate for any brand to communicate their stance on equality. and that's for any brand, not specific or target brands. And almost all of them expect brands to actually take a stand on equality issues here in the US. But also looking at it globally, we see that 80% of people globally agree that it's possible for a brand to support a good cause and also make money at the same time. So here are some actions that we think are important to start considering and pushing for equality and closing that equality gaps at home. So one thing is to be honestly open to research, data, and measurement, so we can uncover discrepancies between different demographics in your employee groups with actual research, actual data, and actual measurement, and be open to an honest analysis of this internal data and also how to apply a non-traditional lens to this. Equality versus equity in opportunity. I think it's important also to look at the level distribution and a balanced advancement in opportunities, because that's where you can detect where there could be an unconscious bias in your organization, resulting in organizational imbalance. And then obviously include everyone in the conversation. I think that's really really positive for business, and definitely make it a strategic priority. One example that I like from here and how to include everyone in the conversation is from Kellogg's, and they've been doing fantastic work with our teams here at Ipsos on cultural authenticity. Like here you see some screenshots of some Hispanic commercial of those delicious Rice Krispie treats. And what I find interesting that they also leverage the internal workforce diversity to reach authentic cultural insights. So making sure proactively that people are having a voice in what the organization does. So looking ahead and globally, outside of the United States, I would like to encourage everyone to take a look and identify existing inequality challenges in your market and your region that can be turned into opportunities. So we can think of things like colorism, if that exists in your market, overrepresentation of some specific groups and the representation of some other specific demographics. I think it's interesting to look at what's happening around your area, how you can help, and also how you can turn that into an opportunity. Before I leave for the moment, I want to highlight a couple of coming publications. So one is a question of gender, which is an analysis of gender classification in internal research from my colleague Trixie Cartwright. We just released earlier this month a super interesting report on authentic 30-country global advisory survey on the LGBTQ+ community. And of course, we just released yesterday a new Ipsos views of our ESG series, More Equal Than Others, where we talk about these issues around inequality. And with that, back to you, Simon.
Well, thank you, Manuel, for this tour. And one of the big things I was taking away from it was your emphasis on robust measurement and on really looking at all of the evidence available. I was in an event with our clients in Turkey yesterday, and the census there has now given the evidence and the numbers there of 5 million people with disabilities in Turkey, and there was a discussion about what that meant for the services and how we can use that kind of information, as you say, to do good, and actually to also do good for society and for the businesses. So that came through very strongly for me, Manuel. Is there any other advice you'd give us, in terms of what else we can do? If there's one thing we could take away to do a better job at understanding and researching inequalities, what would you highlight?
I think what you said is absolutely critical, because knowledge is power and data and research is knowledge. So being able to have access to the data and identify what's the situation of different demographics in terms of opportunity, in terms of pay, in terms of access to resources. It's going to give you always a very clear picture of what's happening and actually where the biases lay, so you can proactively work on that, proactively include everyone in the conversation, and at every level also make it a strategic priority.
Lovely. Thank you for that. Actually, I'm talking about the different countries around the world, and you highlighted that in your data there as well. Radhika, there's interest in the countries you've already shared with us, and we do have some participants from Europe. And their interest, the question, I guess, is, have you been looking at any European countries, and what have you found?
Yes, we have looked at quite a few European countries, I think, and we will definitely be featuring Denmark as one of them. I think in Europe, it falls in the developed world kind of cluster, and there is a lot more of willingness to take on personal initiative and do their bit towards ESG. And I think there is also the what do you call it, the extractivism, which is really using natural resources for commercial benefits. I think that is another stream where there is a lot of work that is happening. So, but I would say European countries, there is also issues around mental health, inclusivity, mental neurodiversity. Those are the different streams. We are seeing much more developed trends around that in the ESG spectrum in the European countries. So S and the individual inequalities and including all on the spectrum, I think there's a dominant theme that I'm seeing coming through for Europe. Yeah.
Interesting. And I might ask perhaps Lauren, for your perspective, working with our clients, I know you see clients who are based in Europe, clients who are based in the States, clients who are based in other countries. Is there anything particularly you've spotted or observed in the more European context when you've been looking at the ESG agenda and hearing about people's priorities? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was behaving so much being on mute. Yes, in Europe, I think, it seems that it's much more accepted is that these are very, very large concerns. You have much less of a polarized culture than you do in other regions, like let's say the US as an example. And they've been dealing with it for quite some time. So I just think the level of acceptance and knowing that you have to take action is quite different when it comes to different parts of the world, because it's all about what you're dealing with day to day, what you're seeing from a social perspective and environmental perspective. And that has to be taken into account. It's hard to do a one size fits all for all regions across the world.
No, and we can see that, Lauren, in the questions actually, because a second question we've got is about the ESG backlash in the US.
That's right.
Is that something? Could you perhaps say a couple of words on that for us?
Yeah. Listen, there are. The US is a very politically polarized environment, particularly today. ESG isn't the only thing that is an issue that divides people ideologically and via political parties. And the backlash is, as I observe it, is largely due to ESG investing. Remember that the genesis of ESG is really an operational and risk management framework. Really, it started as a way to protect the long-term financial viability of companies. The question is whether, there should be those kind of considerations taken into account when you're doing ESG investing. Should you be tying financial returns to things that are good for the world and good for society? And there are different opinions about that. I think partially because there's a difference in short-term returns and long-term returns. I don't think there's a huge disagreement that companies that make sure that they are doing the right thing for the environment, protecting their supply chain, and making sure that they are they are taking into account climate resilience, and making sure that their employee base is diverse, because we know that inclusive and diverse cultures lead to better business decisions. There's been so many studies about that. I don't think there's any disagreement that doing those things is the right thing to do in the long term. I think the question is really more about short-term financial returns. All things require.
Yeah. So that brings us into a question maybe for Manuel to pick up as we go. We think about the US people, public, citizens, consumers. I know as part of the work that you've been doing, you've been looking at this in quite a bit of detail, and increasingly there seems to be more evidence, for example, on the Latino markets, for example. And we've got another question for you, actually, in terms of any other advice you could give us on which indicators to ask or which things to look out for.
In terms of what?
In terms of, we're doing a good job at researching people's views and perspectives on the ground. Actually, the US is a really important case study for some of the reasons Lauren just mentioned, but also because of its diversity as a market that's so large and so complex. So just a question from the floor really about any other advice you'd give us about which indicators to use or which data to latch onto.
Yeah, I think it's very important to be able to look like within the organization how things are, how like different demographics are distributed, not only in terms of ethnic and racial profiles, but also in terms of like gender, sexual orientation, neurodiversity, disabilities at different levels, so we can ensure that people can have a voice. And as Lauren was saying, that has been proven over and over again to lead to better business decisions and better business outcome.
Lovely, thank you for that. Well, I'm going to give the final word to Radhika, because you're based in Singapore. You've been doing this work, and one of the things you're doing is highlighting some of the differences and distinctiveness. Are there any particular things that, if you one or two things that you could single out that perhaps are more uniting or more common as we look towards where we go next and what we need to do to, if you like, do something for the common good?
Indeed, yes. I don't know if it's good or bad, but one is the whole overall sentiment around ESG and the messaging. There is a sentiment of doom and gloom, if I have to quote some of our experts. And I think this is not I think it is a serious issue, but I think over time the messaging has been so like dire and serious and telling people what to do or what not to do. I think people are feeling overwhelmed. People are feeling like they know what are the issues. There's a very high level of knowledge and awareness today I'm seeing across many different markets, but this feeling of guilt to some extent, and almost a sense of insecurity, I think that was a common thing I saw. And I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to bring in the more uplifting sentiments around this topic. That is one thing. The second thing, it is I think a pattern more than a commonality, is to what Lauren was talking about, and even Manuel's point about inequality, is I think there is an implicit tension between the S pillar and the E pillar of ESG. And what is happening is that there is a feeling that developed markets have done their deed and have then become virtuous today, whereas the developing markets feel like you're stealing away our chance for a place in the sun, right? And so I think the S part of it sometimes is loaded. It could be a very easy reason why not to do something on E, or so I think there is that tension which I see wherever there is inequality, even in developed countries. Yeah, so that is another thing to think about.
Watch out for. No, that's perhaps a good way. We're conscious of everyone's agenda and calendars today, but perhaps that's quite a good way to end in the sense that you're highlighting, Radhika, some of the tensions and some of the uncertainties for all of us, whatever our role is, and indeed some of the opportunities. Now, just to say, we've had so many great questions. We haven't been able to cover all of them today, but we will be answering those separately via emails. So with some wonderful comments and thoughts that colleagues on the call have given us. So as Radhika says, it's a very broad topic. It's something which we need to look at holistically, but also has those different dimensions. So we have prepared a special ESG website, which is live now, which we hope will give you some resources to explore as you go about your own business and address your own particular ESG challenges. As I mentioned, the recording, the presentation, and all the resources from today's episode will be sent to you tomorrow. And I do hope you'll be able to join us for our next episode in the Keys webinar series, where we are going to be looking at consumers and the poly crisis. We'll be looking at their reality, and we'll be looking at what may happen next. So we hope you can join us for that as well. In the meantime, thank you for being with us, and have a good rest of the day. All the best.